Did you know Nintendo made almost as much profit from the Switch era as every other generation combined? It wasn't because they sold more consoles and games. In fact, they sold a lot more in the DS Wii generation. How they actually pushed profits to record highs was by consistently charging $60 a game and finding new ways to make money, like charging for online and expanding into mobile games. PlayStation used to trounce Nintendo, but at this point, Nintendo's twice as profitable as their old rival, which might make you wonder, why are they hiking games to $80? I'm sure by now you've seen the Toys R Us catalogs, inflation calculators, and a litany of online arguments. We'll talk Switch 2 prices soon enough. But first, we're going to set up some historical context, because a calculator can't tell the full story. Not only for prices, but what Switch 2 represents, the end of a Nintendo era, and the start of a new one. We've been leafing through annual financial reports, and we gotta tell you, even if you know the company's history, it makes you see it all in a whole new light. So today we're going to look at the past half century, from the birth of Game & Watch to the launch of Switch 2. Maybe that sounds like too much context, but by the end we think you'll see it was merited. Follow the money and you'll understand how Nintendo got where they are today, and where they're likely to go next, and what it could mean for their biggest fans. In the 1970s, Nintendo mostly made toys and playing cards under their longtime president Hiroshi Yamauchi. Unfortunately, it was a decade of recession, and Nintendo's headquarters got hit by an earthquake. By 1980, they were deep in debt and on the road to bankruptcy. But then everything changed when Nintendo's lead inventor Gunpei Yokoi created Game & Watch. It was a huge hit all around the world, quadrupled annual profits, and wiped out all their debt in one fell swoop. It was the end of their money troubles and the beginning of their transformation into the video game giant they are today. After making some arcade games, in 1983 they used all their Game & Watch money to develop a home console, the Famicom. Yamauchi told the team to make it cheap so it could sell for under $100, an ambitiously low price even back then. Famicom was immediately successful, but Nintendo was the only company making games for it. Profits actually fell that year, mostly because Game & Watch was cooling off. They bounced back in '84 though, when third parties started making Famicom games too, and paying Nintendo for the privilege. In 1985, Famicom was reworked into the NES and brought to America. Profits quadrupled again, and over the next few years, Nintendo found their way into 1/3 of American homes and got a foothold in Europe. By 1988, profits had doubled again to nearly $500 million. Nintendo released Game Boy the year after. Everyone thought it had flopped because of its monochrome screen, but it defied expectations and sold faster than Nintendo could make them. Super Famicom hit Japan in 1990, and Super Nintendo in America the year after. It wasn't quite as successful as the NES had been, but together with Game Boy, it made 1991 their first year to hit $1 billion. In just a single decade, Nintendo was making 50 times more since Game & Watch. The mid-90s was a rough patch though. Competitors like Sega and Sony came for the crown, so Nintendo threw the kitchen sink to fight them off, like Satellaview and Virtual Boy. But even their flagship console, the Nintendo 64, was a huge letdown. It sold less than Super NES and barely more than Sega Genesis. Things weren't looking good. They were still making $500 million in annual profits, but at this point they also had $3 billion in expenses, so if things kept getting worse, pretty soon they'd be broke. But then out of nowhere they got extremely lucky. 10 indie devs working out of an apartment made a little game called Pokémon and released it on Game Boy. No one had high hopes for Pokémon, even the people who made it, but it took Japan and eventually the whole world by storm. Game Boy was a dying last-gen system, but Pokémon gave it a second life and made it bigger than ever. Game Boy ended up selling more than all of their 90s hardware combined, from Super Famicom to 64DD and everything in between. Nintendo had just happened to make a small investment in Pokémon years before, and now found themselves partial owners of the world's hottest game franchise. Spin-offs, merchandise, cartoons, trading cards, Pokémon was absolutely printing money. By 1999, Nintendo hit a new record, with nearly $1.5 billion in profit. Things were going good again, but with their livelihoods depending so much on Pokémon, they were in a vulnerable position. The early 2000s were frankly not great. Pokémon Gold and Silver sold like hotcakes, but a lot less than last time. Seemingly, Pokémon was a fad on its way out. Nintendo launched GameCube in 2001 thinking it'd be a big success, but it got destroyed by PlayStation 2, and even lost to newcomer Xbox. Nintendo was now in 4 generations of decline. Game Boy Advance also released in 2001, and although it did better than GameCube, it still didn't come close to reaching the highs of the original Game Boy. Its games didn't do as well either. Pokémon, for example, was still trending downward. Everything was trending downward. A lot of people thought before long Nintendo would have to give up the hardware business, just as Sega had done after Dreamcast. It was at this point Nintendo decided to change strategy. Prior to 1990, they'd followed Gunpei Yokoi's 2 philosophies, the blue ocean and thinking sideways with mature technology. In other words, instead of using cutting-edge tech, they took old tech and made it fun, in ways no one had ever thought of before. That way they were competing on ideas, instead of who had the best microchips. It also let Nintendo sell stuff for cheap, so anyone could afford to play their games. Game & Watch, for example, was basically a reworked calculator, and Game Boy was monochrome in an age of color. The competition, like Sega Game Gear and Atari Lynx, did have color, but Game Boy's batteries lasted longer, it sold for a much lower price, and it came with Tetris as a free pack-in. So despite being the weaker handheld, it outsold the competition 10-1. That was Nintendo's old way of doing things, the Yokoi method. But starting with Super Nintendo and up till GameCube, they abandoned Yokoi's philosophies to focus on power and technology. PlayStation was 32 bits, so Nintendo leapfrogged to 64. Yokoi resigned soon after, saying it wasn't the same Nintendo it used to be, that he helped build. Some other guys went with him to start a new gaming company, but sadly Yokoi died in a car crash soon after. Nintendo kept pushing forward, and made GameCube more powerful than PlayStation 2, but they couldn't win on that battlefield. Sony kept clobbering them, and every Nintendo system sold worse than the last. Satoru Iwata took over as Nintendo's new president in 2002, and saw they couldn't keep on the way they were going. He decided to change course, and take Nintendo back to Yokoi's philosophies, sideways thinking, and the blue ocean. Be different, and be affordable. And that's why, instead of a more powerful Game Boy, in 2004 we got Nintendo DS. At the same E3, Sony unveiled the PlayStation Portable, which was technologically far more advanced. But DS whooped it anyway, like a rerun of Game Boy vs. Game Gear. Nintendo finally beat Sony because they returned to the battlefield of ideas. And just as importantly, because DS's sold for $150, while PSPs were $250. A couple years later, they launched the Revolution, also known as the Wii. It was weaker than Sony and Microsoft's consoles, but again sold at a much lower price. And it had a great new idea: motion controls. Nintendo of America's president, Reggie Fils-Aimé, fought to make Wii Sports a free pack-in, to show what Wii was all about. But Nintendo didn't want to give away their work for free. So in Japan, Wii Sports wasn't bundled in, but everywhere else, it was. Ultimately, the results showed Wii massively overperformed with the free pack-in, and for the first time in generations, Nintendo won a home console war. They were back on top. Iwata made the right call to return to Yokoi's ideas, and Reggie was right to give away Wii Sports. In fact, the numbers suggest without Wii Sports, Nintendo would have come a distant third in that generation. Fortunately, they did pack it in, and at the peak, Nintendo was making $5 billion a year, 10 times more than the N64 era, when they were at the height of cutting-edge tech. Between Wii and DS, they sold over 250 million systems and almost 2 billion games, a record generation Nintendo's never surpassed even to this day. Unfortunately, they got overconfident from their success and strayed from some core values, so when they released 3DS in 2011, they overpriced it at $250. Millions of die-hard fans bought it at launch, then sales fell off a cliff. No one else was buying them, and for the first time in modern history, Nintendo was losing money. Iwata cut his salary in half as a way to take responsibility for the failure, and other top executives followed suit. Some fans remember Iwata did it to avoid layoffs, but his base salary wasn't even $1 million. The company, though, was losing hundreds of millions. There were no layoffs, but that's not why Iwata did it. It was about solidarity and symbolism. The same day, he slashed the 3DS's price down to $170. Nintendo was now selling them at a loss, in hopes they could earn it back in game sales. To make it up to the loyal fans who paid $250, Nintendo announced the 3DS Ambassador Program, which gave them 20 free NES and Game Boy Advance games. The plan worked, and 3DS sales skyrocketed. Ultimately, it never reached the levels of success as the original DS. It was, after all, an evolution rather than a revolution. But at 76 million sold, it ended up being about as popular as Game Boy Advance had been. So, all in all, a good comeback story. While all that was going on, Wii U came out in 2012. It sold out at launch thanks to the usual diehards, so much so they were getting scalped on eBay. But then, just like 3DS, sales dried up fast. Nintendo priced it $300 for the basic model and $350 if you wanted more storage and Nintendo Land as a pack-in. Even at that price, it was selling at a loss, and only barely cheaper than PlayStation 4. The marketing wasn't great either, with a lot of people thinking Wii U was just a new controller. But its failure was really more about Nintendo's hubris. They were overconfident and too expensive. Iwata took another half salary, knocked $50 off the deluxe model, and before long was bundling in free games as well. But this time, they couldn't turn things around, and only ended up selling 14 million units. Nintendo was in the red 3 years in a row, and only managed to squeeze small profits in the generation's back half, thanks to the 3DS's redemption arc. Suffice it to say, they'd been humbled. Iwata tragically passed away of cancer in 2015, at age 55. But before he went, he got the ball rolling on Nintendo's next system, the Switch. It was sideways thinking and blue ocean top to bottom. A hybrid console you could play on your TV or out on the go, and even cheaper to produce than Wii U. Iwata was famously a developer, but a gamer at heart. After he passed, the next president was Tatsumi Kimishima, who prior to Nintendo spent 27 years in the banking industry. He was always meant to be transitionary, so in 2018 he stepped aside to let Shuntaro Furukawa take the throne. At university, Furukawa majored in political science and economics, then joined Nintendo as an accountant. He later moved into marketing and climbed the corporate ladder all the way to the top, where he remains to this day. These guys are on record having played some games, like Mario Tennis Aces, but we think it's fair to say in their hearts they're really more businessmen than gamers. Iwata invented the Nintendo Direct, so he could talk to fans and keep us updated on what the company was up to. Contrast that with the new president who keeps investors up to date at shareholder meetings, but doesn't show up for directs. A year after Furukawa took over, Reggie retired as NOA's president, saying he wanted to spend more time with his family. His replacement was Doug Bowser, who'd previously been an executive at Electronic Arts. In addition to running the American branch, Bowser later got appointed as executive officer at Nintendo Japan as well. But that's getting ahead of the story. Iwata wasn't there to see it, but the Switch finally launched in 2017 and sold out as usual. This time though, after the diehards came and went, normies continued buying Switches in droves. Games flew off shelves too. For comparison, back in the 90s, Ocarina of Time sold 8 million copies. On Switch, Breath of the Wild sold 34 million. Mario Kart 64 sold 10 million, while Mario Kart 8 sold nearly 70. And Pokémon bounced back too. For generations, they'd been stagnant around 15 million, but on Switch, they nearly doubled their player base. Something we haven't addressed yet is profit margins. That basically means for every dollar you make in revenue, the percentage you get to keep as profits, after paying all your expenses. To businessmen, profit margins are very, very important. Historically, Nintendo's margins were around 20-25%. On Switch, they got up to 35%. Switch had higher margins than any Nintendo system, and much higher than the competition. PlayStation sells twice as much product, but only makes half the profit, because their margins are 10%. In the years since PlayStation started charging $70 a game, they've only barely stayed above water. Meanwhile, Nintendo's making bank with $60 games. Much of that's thanks to Yokoi's old sideways thinking mentality. Switches are cheap to produce, so they can sell them for $300 and make money doing it. Compare that to a cutting-edge PS5, which even at $500 initially sold at a loss. The same goes for games. PlayStation's cost more to make, Nintendo's cost less. With Switch's high sales and low costs, it was already on the road to huge profits. But Nintendo's new leadership wanted to push margins even higher. In the past, almost every system from Game Boy to Wii U had Player's Choice and Nintendo Selects, which lowered prices to $40 or less, after they hit benchmarks like 1 million copies sold. In recent generations, they'd go all the way down to 20. But they put a stop to that in the Switch era. Games typically sold for $60 full price, and stayed there, pretty much forever. Former Nintendo employees said the strategy is to train our brains to, quote, respect the value, and never expect discounts. In other words, train us to think Nintendo games are automatically and forever worth full price. It doesn't matter if it's a 6-hour budget title or over a decade old. If you see a Nintendo character's face on the cover, you should respect its value. So far, the training's worked, and paid huge dividends for the guys at the top. Here's a real-life example to show how that new strategy affects margins. Mario Kart 64 launched for $60. In less than a year, Nintendo had made their money back several times over, so from that point on, it became a $40 player's choice. Compare that to Mario Kart 8, which released on Wii U for $60, then came to Switch 3 years later at the same price. It's still $60 to this day, with only modest sales at rare intervals. Also, keep in mind that back in the 90s, physical cartridges and physical stores ate up a good chunk of the price tag. Switch carts are cheaper to manufacture, and half their sales are digital anyway, so Nintendo gets to keep a bigger piece of the pie. Add all that up, and Mario Kart 64 made around $250 million, while 8's closer to $3 billion, plus extra from selling DLC. Though we should keep in mind, development costs have risen over the years. We know from interviews that making Mario Kart 64 cost around $5 or $10 million. Nintendo's gotten more secretive since then, but 8 was probably closer to $50 million. And development isn't Nintendo's only expense. There's R&D, marketing, HR, and so on, and they spend more on all that than they used to. And of course, most games don't sell Mario Kart numbers, though they do massively outsell their N64 counterparts, and their prices stay consistent at $60. Apologies if that was a lot of math. Point is, they're not only selling more copies, they're charging fans more over time, which raises profit margins. And it's why comparing modern prices to 1990s catalogs is frankly kind of irrelevant, because the economy of scale, which is basically, you sell more games, your margins get fatter. Nintendo used to pass a lot of the savings on to fans, but nowadays they go as profits to shareholders. All this largely applies to other generations as well. Twilight Princess was a Wii launch title for $50, eventually discounted to $20. Breath of the Wild launched with Switch, sold over 4 times more, and still cost $60 with $20 DLC. Besides training us to respect the value, Nintendo's new leadership found a few more ways to increase profits as well. Wii, Wii U, DS, 3DS, none of them charged for playing online. In 2018, Switch started charging. Currently, it's got 34 million subscribers, paying around $1 billion a year. That's about 20 times more than Virtual Console used to make. Mobile's another new source of income. Iwata was famously opposed to the idea, and said the company would, quote, cease to be Nintendo if they got into mobile games. After years of pressure from investors, he eventually relented, but promised Nintendo would do it with integrity. And he made it clear in no uncertain terms that free-to-play games were a scourge. After he was gone, his successors made a bunch of free-to-play games anyway, and packed them with microtransactions, loot boxes, and subscriptions. Games like Mario Kart Tour and Fire Emblem Heroes have made billions. A lot of people spend hundreds of dollars on them, sometimes thousands. Heroes is the biggest cash cow of the bunch, and appears to have made more than all the real Fire Emblem games combined. Some of y'all are probably thinking, well, good, they're making more money, which means more games. But actually, they're making fewer games. In the DS Wii era, we got 7 first-party games a year, but on Switch, we get 2 or 3. Not counting ports and remasters, Nintendo only released 22 new games over the Switch's 8-year lifespan. They publish fewer second and third-party games as well, but mostly we want to focus on first-party. You know, the ones with that famous Nintendo magic. Just have a look at the main mascot. For 3D Mario, Wii got Galaxy 1 and 2, but Switch only got Odyssey. For 2D, there was New Super Mario Bros. On DS, and the sequel on Wii, but Switch only got Wonder. Mario Kart saw new entries on DS and Wii, but Switch never got one. Instead, they ported the Wii U entry. And that's pretty emblematic of the entire generation, re-releasing more old games at full price, while developing fewer new ones. Much of the savings got stashed away as profits. Currently, they've got $15 billion sitting in a piggy bank, which is enough to make 100 Marios. Nintendo's most profitable year of all time was 2020, thanks to COVID lockdowns. Everyone was stuck inside and playing a lot more video games than ever before. That was also the year Nintendo did some time-limited releases, most famously Mario 3D All-Stars and Mario 35, to celebrate Mario's birthday. Seemingly, it was intended to grab a quick $500 million and as many NSO subscribers as possible before the next financial report, as fans rushed to play them before they got permanently deleted on March 31st, the last day of Nintendo's fiscal year. They ended the year with a record of nearly $6 billion in profits, which is 300 times more than 1980 and 11 times more than 1996. Profits remained high even after life went back to normal, and all told, Switch was by far their most profitable generation. They made almost as much as every other generation combined, getting NESs into 1/3 of American homes, Pokémon fever sweeping the globe, and even though the DS Wii era sold more systems and games, all that pales in comparison to what Nintendo's new leadership managed to accomplish. They pushed the stock price to record highs as well. Investors who put in $1 million a decade ago have $5 million today. The shareholders are very, very happy. And that brings us to the present. As we're writing this, Switch 2 was just properly revealed. By all appearances, it's a shift back to the Super Nintendo to GameCube era. An evolution instead of a revolution. The focus is more on power and less on sideways thinking and affordability. The shift was evident the moment it revealed. At the Switch 2 Direct, they talked a lot about resolution, frames per second, and HDR, but never told us the price. Contrast that with Switch 1's reveal, where they told us the price right at the start, but never once mentioned graphics. The old Blue Ocean strategy boiled down to being unique and being cheap. Currently though, Switch 2's positioned less as the affordable option and more as a premium product. $450 is a higher entry point than PlayStation, Xbox, or even Steam Deck. Extra controllers cost more too. But the biggest sticker shock was the games, which have gone up to $70 and $80. Nintendo Gold points that gave 5% back for digital purchases were discontinued a week before the Direct. And game vouchers, which let NSO subscribers get 2 games for $50 each, won't be usable on Switch 2 titles. In other words, the system costs 50% more, and games can cost up to 60% more. All that's to say, it appears the days of Iwata following Yokoi's path, of thinking sideways and the Blue Ocean, are over. This will be Nintendo's first full generation with Furukawa in charge, and it seems he's looking to push margins even higher. Though to be fair, inflation has gone up 30% since Switch 1 came out, and it is kind of his job to extract as much cash out of us as possible. Now we should mention, those were the prices the day of the Direct. Since then, there's been complications in the US with tariffs out of Nintendo's control. The situation's still evolving and might change by the time you see this, but currently tariffs on Vietnam are 10%, which led to controllers and accessories getting marked up. A couple weeks later, Xbox announced they were marking up as well, including some future games also going to $80. We'll mostly leave those details and tariffs aside though, and focus on Switch 2's intended prices, because as soon as folks saw them, there was immediate backlash. In a lot of countries, they're even more expensive. Respect the value and paying for online were gradual subtle changes, but these new prices hit all at once, and made some people feel they couldn't afford to be Nintendo fans anymore. Meanwhile, millions of other fans couldn't wait to place their pre-orders, and were annoyed by the negativity. So they hit him with Toys R Us catalogs and inflation calculators, and told him games cost more to make nowadays, so Nintendo needs to charge $80. A lot of folks didn't know the historical context of what was happening, the change in philosophies or Nintendo's profit margins, but they felt in their bones Nintendo had changed somehow. That's why we're making this video, to provide that context, for folks on both sides of the aisle. Because Nintendo has changed, and we can't help wondering if it's to their own detriment. Part of Nintendo's appeal has always been affordability. That's what helped make them so popular in the first place, especially with families. But if the new management charges premium prices, a lot of parents are going to buy something else for Christmas. Nintendo's long been in the business of selling nostalgia, so losing a generation of kids could have long-term consequences, not only for fans and families, but shareholders as well. You put Pikachu and Mario in front of a kid and there's a good chance you've got a customer for life. Those are the people who grow up to buy your merch, pre-orders, and stand in line for midnight releases. They're why profits are at record highs. If kids are priced out of kids' games, A lot of them you'll never get back. It might have been better for everyone to keep the gravy train rolling at more affordable price points, which up until now made Nintendo rich and popular. Before we go any further, we want to make clear, we don't think it's too late for Nintendo to change course, and we don't hate the Switch 2. I'm sure anyone who buys it will have fun. Our critiques are more about executives' monetary strategies and online arguments defending them. For example, there's a narrative going around that Nintendo was always expensive, and that if you take inflation into account, Switch 2 costs the same as all their other systems. So if folks could afford it then, they can afford it now. But that's leaving out some key details. We already covered games, so now let's look at consoles. NES did technically launch for $180, which is $530 in today's money, but only in test markets like New York. And that was the price of the deluxe set, which came with Rob the Robot, Gyromite, Duck Hunt, a Zapper light gun, and 2 controllers. When Nintendo launched nationwide, the deluxe set only cost $160. Most people ended up buying smaller bundles anyway, like the $100 action set, with Super Mario and 2 controllers. You'll recall from earlier, the system was specifically designed to sell for under $100. Affordability was its entire premise. Even accounting for inflation, that's half the price of an equivalent Switch 2 bundle. In the next generation, Super Nintendo launched with Super Mario World and an extra controller for $200, got cut to $150, then down to $100 the year after launch. In the US, 85% of Super Nintendos sold at those reduced prices. N64 is a similar story. It was $200, then $150 a few months later, and gradually down to half price. You've probably seen that famous home video of kids getting an N64 for Christmas. That was Christmas '98. By then, N64s were $130 and came with an extra controller. Historically, most people bought Nintendo systems for under $300, bundled with games, controllers, or both. That's $300 after accounting for inflation, in today's money. Compare that to modern Nintendo, who, just like their games, don't discount hardware anymore. Switch 1 got some modest limited-time bundles, and a cheaper model with no dock, a smaller screen, worse battery life, and Joy-Cons that don't come off. But now, 8 years later, the main units never dropped a penny. Under this new respect the value philosophy, it's hard to imagine Switch 2 bundles dropping under $300 anytime soon. So for a lot of families, it's just never going to make financial sense to get one. Especially when they can get another system for less, with cheaper controllers and lower-priced games. Nintendo's positioning themselves as the premium option. That's the opposite of what they used to be, and a lot of people who bought in before won't anymore, or can't anymore. And that leads us to the titular question, will the Switch 2 fail? If history's any guide, diehards will probably buy it out at launch, especially since there are more diehards today than ever before. For a lot of them, Switch 2 is exactly what they wanted. They didn't want the old Nintendo and their sideways thinking. They wanted power. And the new Nintendo's happy to give it to them, at the requisite price. The old Nintendo used to say people don't know what they want till they see it, and they aimed to surprise and delight with ideas no one else thought of. When they succeeded, diehards and normies alike flocked to their revolutions. But this time the real test of success will be if normies want to lay down a week's wages for a better version of an old idea, and if they'll keep showing up in year 2, 3, and beyond. That's who decides if Switch 2 succeeds or not. Some people talk of the so-called Nintendo curse, that every successful console's followed by a flop. That's a bit of a myth though, as it really only applies to the Wii U generation. A more likely scenario is that history repeats itself with the Super Nintendo to GameCube era, where evolutionary consoles didn't flop, but did sell a lot less than the one before. That may be what management's expecting. There will be fewer Switch 2 owners, so they plan to squeeze more money out of each one. But those higher prices, along with economic headwinds and increased competition, could push Switch 2 sales deeper than the 30% drop experienced by evolutionary consoles of the past. Could we see a huge price drop and free ambassador games like what happened with 3DS? There is precedent, but unless sales get really bad after the diehards dissipate, we wouldn't bet on big discounts. Nowadays, Nintendo prefers to remaster 10 or 15-year-old games and sell them full price, rather than sell them as cheap downloads like they used to. So we wouldn't get our hopes up for Ambassador Wii games either. On the other hand, anything is possible. Maybe Switch 2 will be the best-selling console of all time, and all this analysis will age like milk. But historically speaking, that's the least likely possibility. That said, a lot can happen in a console's lifespan. Nintendo's got all kinds of levers they can pull if things don't go their way. They can offer more generous bundles, bring back gold points, vouchers, Nintendo Selects, and release a cheaper model if consumers won't pay today's prices. But if they are willing to pay, Nintendo could push variable pricing even higher, sell deluxe models, and raise the rates for Switch Online. They've played a lot of those cards before, so they're likely to play some of them again, just in a different order, depending on their year-to-year financials. Or God forbid the global economy gets so bad with inflation and tariffs that the competition raises their prices even higher, which will make Nintendo the affordable option again. In that doomsday scenario, maybe normies will come to see $80 games as relatively cheap, and all this will become the new normal. Regardless, Nintendo can always fall back on Switch 1's huge install base if they need to, and they've got $15 billion in cash stuffed under their mattress basically, if they need to ride out a storm. And their income streams have gotten more diversified, not only with mobile, but movies, merchandise, and theme parks as well. So we think it's safe to say, even in the worst case scenario, Nintendo's survival is virtually guaranteed. Before closing out, we just want to say, we're not ideologues opposed to the concept of profits, and we don't hate Switch 2. It looks pretty awesome actually, even if it does mark the end of an era. And if you've watched this channel before, you know we certainly don't hate Nintendo. We were the kids getting consoles 2 Christmases after launch, and we've been fans ever since. We want what's best for Nintendo, but we also want what's best for fans. And frankly, we're not sure recent decision-making's best for anybody. The new leadership? I'm sure they're perfectly nice guys, but we'd hate to see them burn through all the goodwill their predecessors built up over generations, just for the sake of short-term profits. Nintendo's at a crossroads. Prices families can afford, or prices they have to respect. Offering value, or extracting value. Again, it's not too late for management to change course. We're not so naive to hope they'll roll it all back, but people just don't want to feel priced out, screwed over, or taken for granted. Profits can go up, margins can be healthy, and prices can be affordable all at once. Switch 2 can do that. Unfortunately, Nintendo might have to get humbled again to learn that lesson. Did you know Gunpei Yokoi saved Nintendo from going broke twice? Yamauchi practically begged him to be the next president, but he didn't want the job, so Iwata eventually took over instead. If you want to see Yokoi and Iwata's full life stories, click one of the videos on screen. Special thanks to an accountant who helped us out but wanted to remain anonymous, along with Nintendo Forecast, NintenDeen, A Talking Sock, and FamiWiki.org's owner Brenden for consultation and proofreading. And of course, thank you for watching. See you next time.